You don't know what fear is until you experience this. I'm telling you.
I knew that airplane inside and out.
The most produced American military airplane in history. 18,188 of them were built.
Everybody wanted to be a pilot, but we had to have bombardiers and navigators.
The Liberator went on, of course, to become the great strategic U.S. Army Air Force bomber.
Now, this is your place. This is where you'll serve America best. Young men of America, your future's in the sky. Your wings are waiting.
The first day we were there, of course, we were unpacking and making preparations. And that night there was an air raid.
Once you see England, that's when all the chatter starts. That's when the gunners start yapping. Did you see that? Did you see that? I had two waist gunners. One was 17 and the other one was 18. He came up to me and said he was praying all the whole time.
We realized that this is not all going to be fun.
My father flew the B-24 out of Italy. His plane crashed May 29th, 1944. I was like 2 months old when he died.
I think that there are men and women who have served our country and they fought and died for our country. I think this airplane is a testament to them. I'm just the one privileged enough to get to sit in the seat and actually recreate what they did for our country.
In every conflict, there is always an unsung hero, like the Hurricane in the Battle of Britain. The B-24, the Liberator, is regarded as the silent partner in the United States Army Air Force daylight campaigns against Germany. Made in greater numbers than the B-17 Flying Fortress, able to carry a greater bomb load further than its better-known counterpart, over 18,000 examples rolled off the production lines.
It was a 10-man airplane. It was big. It was almost like a little house. There was two decks, a lower deck with a bombardier, the navigator, and I was down there. Up above was a pilot and co-pilot that drove the plane, and behind them was the engineer. He had a turret all of his own, and he was the engineer. And then there was two waist gunners in back, and then we had Jimmy in the tail.
The B-24, it flew longer missions, flew higher, flew faster, carried more bombs than the B-17, but it was kind of forgotten. The B-24 served all over. It served in the Pacific, it served in Africa, it served in Europe. The Canadians used them, the British used them, the Americans used them. It was an allied airplane. It wasn't just used by one group. It's a very well-traveled machine.
The B-24 was a slightly later aircraft. It first flew in 1939, 4 years or so on from the B-17. It had the high aspect ratio Davis wing, which would be both a benefit and a handicap in its life. The Liberator almost didn't exist because at the beginning of the war, the American authorities approached Consolidated to build B-17 Flying Fortresses. Reuben Fleet, the president of the company, and some of his executives went off to have discussions and then decided that they would come up with their own bomber. Hence the Model 32, the B-24 Liberator.
By 1939, a decision had been made, and the prototype, the XB-24, was ordered on the provision that it flew before the end of the year. As confident as Consolidated were with the design, actually getting the prototype into the air proved trying. The concept was simple, but the engineering advanced, and she finally took to the air with just 2 days left on the deadline.
The disadvantages of the Davis Wing and the B-24 in the European theatre of operations were undoubtedly its inability to fly as high as the B-17. The B-17 comfortably above 25,000 feet. The Liberator got very mushy. The aircraft became more unstable at the higher altitudes. The B-17 was the more rugged of the two aircraft in that particular operating theatre.
But the Liberator came into its own in the Far East because of its range. And they built 19,000 B-24s compared to 12,000 B-17s.
The earliest Liberators were bound for France, and after the fall of the country, French orders were transferred to the RAF, who were struggling to develop a modern long-range bomber. The earliest examples, the A model, had a simple glazed nose with a single machine gun. Ironically, RAF Liberators started flying west rather than east as a critical long-range component in coastal command. The best-known surviving example, Diamond Lil, is also one of the oldest.
Diamond Lil started out as a B-24A. She was laid out as a B-24A with an American serial number. It was never actually on the airplane. The French purchased the airplane and then it was going to be completed as a French bomber. The Germans overran them. The British took all the French orders for consolidated aircraft. So the airplane ended up being an LB-30, which is nothing more than the British designation for a B-24A. Basically, the only differences were the radios were British radios and they had a different caliber machine guns. The other minor differences, like with the way the heaters worked and all, but essentially it was the same airplane.
Perhaps an unsung or almost forgotten activity of the B-24 was its first introduction to combat, not by the US Army Air Force, but by the RAF. And the Liberator made a significant contribution to the victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. And during the course of the Second World War, Liberators sunk more U-boats than any other Allied aircraft. An amazing feat. Because of the Liberator bridging that Atlantic gap, the U-boats were forced to stay submerged. That meant, as they were submerged, they were less effective. They could not travel as far or as fast. Out of that victory, there would have been no D-Day, no Overlord, because the supplies would never have got across the Atlantic.
The Liberator's high wing left the fuselage uncluttered and ideal for cargo, and the RAF quickly deployed the type as a ferry and logistics aircraft, stripped of guns and armour. It also served, bizarrely, with BOAC as a civilian transport, serving the Middle and Far East.
At Ford's Willow Run, near Detroit, manpower shortage had early become a problem. From its overworked, trackless trains to its assembly line, the need for workers had risen sharply. And Willow Run, the world's largest plant producing a single item, the B-24, had a goal of 1 bomber an hour, a goal impossible to reach with manpower alone.
With so many able-bodied men joining the war effort, that left a massive shortage of workforce in the aircraft factories. So during the Second World War, Roosevelt's answer to that was encouraging women to sign up to work in the aircraft factories. Obviously, this wasn't going to be suitable for everyone. Many women had children, they had other jobs to do. So they actually did different things to encourage them to join. So they set up bus services to help them get to and from the factories. They set up childcare facilities, and many of them enjoyed it so much that they stayed on after the war and continued with their jobs in the factories.
What's really interesting at North American is they were kind of evolved on the subject. They were a little ahead of their peers in the aircraft manufacturing industry in terms of bringing women in. Certainly they were ahead of Ford in terms of thinking of what women's capabilities could be on an assembly line. But what's really interesting is we've come to know Rosie the Riveter as this pop culture icon and this person who built airplanes during the war as being a sort of character type. It's fascinating to me that even at peak employment, women only really made up between 31 and 39% of the workforce in aircraft factories around the United States.
Ford pays tribute to the women whose help made it possible. To American women everywhere, whose valor on the industrial front has sped the day of victory. Staunch were our modern women as they answered their country's call, and in the uniform of the WWII and other services, released thousands of men for duty at the front.
By 1941, the US government realised that simply leaving B-24 production as a private concern would not fulfil the sheer volume of aircraft that were required. Thus, the Liberator pool program was formed, with subcontractors not making components but entire aircraft. This meant in total there were 5 manufacturing bases: Ford at Willow Run, Consolidated at San Diego and Fort Worth, Douglas in Tulsa, and North American south of Dallas.
An announcement in October of 1942 tells the Liberator men they are now the 2nd Bombardment Wing, early predecessor of the 2nd Air Division.
That was my first flight, so I don't know what to think. So here we take off. After we get past the channel, then you start climbing. You put your oxygen mask when you get 10,000 feet, and you keep climbing. You get to the IP, which is the initial point. Prior to that, you're loose. You're flying loose, not close. But the IP to the target is when the lead tells you, okay, tuck it in, get your planes close, so you get a good bomb pattern down there. Now remember, you're getting close, and you're flying steady, and no maneuvers. You're sitting ducks up there with the yak-yak. And sure enough, we were close to the front. As soon as we got near the target, here comes these shells.
So the average age of the air crews operating the B-24s was between about the ages of 18 to 24. And then the ground crews went slightly older, so they could go from anything to about 20 years old right up to 40 plus years old, with some of the older and more experienced crew chiefs.
We had the sheep line suits just like the enlisted men on the airplane. And we had the sheep line boots, so, and we just stayed. If it rained, and it did a lot, but that was a normal thing to expect. Now, some of the crew chiefs built a little hut down by their airplane and put a little heater in there and used surplus oil, and some of them stayed in those huts rather than go back to the barracks. It gets warmer in there because our barracks only had one coke-fired stove right in the center. Unless your cot was by that stove, you had to use all of your blankets to keep warm.
We lived in Nissen huts. We had 2 crews of officers, 8, to a Nissen hut, which is, we call it a Quonset hut. Concrete floor. The British had a coke stove, which was about 12 inches across, and the coke ration was 1 wheelbarrow load of coke per hut per week. Well, that might give you about 2 hours of heat if you were clustered around that.
You adjusted to what you needed to do. In the summertime, it was nice because the days were long and it was daylight for a long time. Wintertime, we had to use a flashlight a lot to see what we were doing, making changes.
So many of these young airmen had probably never left their home states, never travelled outside of the US, so to suddenly find themselves here in the UK, thousands of miles from home, away from family and friends, they found it really, really difficult. Obviously, you've got the main difference being the temperature and the climate here in England compared to some of the southern states in the US. It was a cold, penetrating damp that a lot of them have never experienced before. And it was so different that when they first arrived in England, when they came off the troop ships and the aircraft, when they landed in the UK, they were actually given guidebooks to tell them a little bit about England, how to act and everything else, because we also were very different in the way, in race as well. We were a much older country, we've been here for a lot longer, but we were also very behind the times, especially here in rural East Anglia. It was very difficult when they first arrived, and they had to overcome those differences quite quickly.
As the Second World War moved on in 1942-43, there were three main air divisions in the UK. The 2nd Air Division, based primarily around Norwich, Norfolk, England, was a B-24 Heartland.
The first day we were there, of course, we were unpacking and making preparations. And that night there was an air raid. We realized that this is not all going to be fun. We always thought they'd come back, but on the very first mission, which was to Berlin, 2 airplanes of my squadron didn't come back. And so that night we knew that, you know, this is real business over here. It's not just training flights.
You don't know what fear is until you experience this, I'm telling you. We're flying off this guy's wing, and he gets a direct hit. And after that, we drop our bombs, but we carried 6,000 pounds. The B-17 carried 5,000 pounds.
And now the heavy bombers are soon to be stood down. On the first mission in 1942, 20 Liberators reached their target and dropped 50 tons of bombs.
There was a real sad day that happened too at our base. One morning very early, probably about 5 o'clock, there was a massive boom. Shook everybody. We'd been down to the revetment, but there was a big ball of fire right at the end of runway 27, and we were located near there. It had 7 1,000-pound bombers, and it's reported they pulled up too soon and it stalled and crashed right at just near the end of the runway. Of course, no one survived that. Some of the bombs exploded too, so it was a big crater. But I went over later that morning to see what happened. And of course it had already been, they thought they'd cleaned up everything. But another fellow and I picked up a piece of aluminum that was about 3 foot square. And under it was a torso, no arms, no legs, just a parachute harness. I couldn't forget that for a long, long time.